They gathered to bury the dead, but ended up unearthing the truth. The morning of the funeral was meant to be solemn, sacred. Outside St. Michael's Cathedral in Boston, a fine October rain misted over rows of black sedans and designer umbrellas. Boston's elite had come dressed in mourning, ready to pay their respects to Lila and Jackson Jose, pillars of the community, symbols of elegance and philanthropy. Inside, the cathedral was adorned in white lilies and pale roses, their fragrance mingling with incense and grief. Stained glass windows cast soft light over tearful faces. The city's press had gathered discreetly in the back, prepared to capture what was expected to be a respectful farewell. At the very front of the cathedral sat their only child, Jackson Jose III. 35, handsome and impeccably dressed, he was now the sole heir to not only a massive real estate fortune, but also a philanthropic legacy revered throughout New England. To everyone watching, he appeared composed, a stoic son bearing his parents with dignity. No one could have guessed what he was hiding. Father Matthews began to speak, his voice echoing beneath the vaulted ceiling. But before he could finish the first line of his eulogy, the heavy wooden doors of the cathedral burst open with a thunderous creak. A gust of cold wind and rain swept in, and heads turned instinctively. What they saw left the room breathless. A teenage boy stood in the entrance, drenched from head to toe. His dark hair clung to his forehead. His hands shook slightly, but he held something in his arms with unwavering care. A baby girl swaddled in a soft pink blanket. Her tiny face rested against his chest, peaceful amidst the chaos she was about to awaken. Gasps filled the cathedral. "What is he doing here?" someone whispered. But the boy didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, boots wetting the marble aisle, and raised his voice just enough to be heard by all. "I'm sorry," he said, voice trembling but clear. "But Mr. and Mrs. Jose deserve to know the truth before they're laid to rest." The entire cathedral fell silent. He paused, then glanced down at the baby in his arms. "This is Elaine, he continued. "She's their granddaughter." A collective gasp swept through the pews like a wave. Jackson Jose III rose slowly from his seat, his face drained of color, hands gripping the pew in front of him so tightly his knuckles turned white. But it was the woman sitting in the third pew, Catherine Jose, Lila's sister, who broke the silence with a choked sob. Her eyes locked on the baby's face. "Those eyes," she whispered, trembling. "She has the Jose eyes." The teenager stood his ground. His name was Sebastian Daly, and the baby in his arms was the daughter of his missing sister, Esther Daly. Esther, a bright and hard-working young woman, had been the Jose family's housekeeper for 2 years before vanishing without a trace 9 months earlier. The timing now seemed far from coincidental. Security began to move toward the boy, but Catherine Jose rose with unshakable force. "Stop," she commanded. "Let the boy speak." Sebastian's voice grew stronger. Esther didn't just disappear. She was pushed into silence. She trusted Jackson Jose. She believed his promises. She thought his parents would accept the truth. But instead, she vanished. And this child, their grandchild, was kept hidden. Reporters in the back pulled out their notebooks and phones, sensing the story of the decade unfolding before them. "She left behind a diary," Sebastian said, pulling an envelope from the baby's blanket, "and letters. Proof of everything. She made me promise that if anything happened to her, I'd bring Elaine here, to the people who deserved to know, to the family who needed to hear the truth." Tension electrified the room. Jackson still hadn't moved. His jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on Sebastian, but he remained frozen. For the first time, the polished air looked exposed, vulnerable. The baby stirred and let out a soft whimper. Her cry echoed in the sacred space like a demand, a cry not of grief, but of awakening. Catherine stepped into the aisle, moving slowly toward the child. Her expression was unreadable, but her hands trembled as she reached for the envelope. "Jackson," she said coldly, "is this true?" Still he said nothing. Sebastian continued, unwavering. "My sister believed in justice. She believed in love. She believed that truth mattered more than reputation. And now you all deserve to know what really happened to her, what Jackson did to her, what this family has tried to bury." It was no longer a funeral honorable. It had become a trial of legacy, reputation, and truth. What began as a eulogy for two philanthropic icons had transformed into a confrontation with the past. The baby in Sebastian's arms was not just an interruption, she was a revelation. She embodied both the shame that had been hidden and the hope that could still survive. The rain outside turned to thunder as if nature itself was reacting. Inside the cathedral, hearts beat louder than prayers, and the truth, after being buried for too long, had finally forced its way to the surface. This wasn't the end of a family story, it was the beginning of one. Beneath the surface of a flawless legacy was something far more dangerous. Deceit dressed in elegance. For decades, the Jose family had been admired across Boston and beyond. Their philanthropic reach extended from children's hospitals to inner-city education programs, and their last name had become synonymous with generosity, reform, and community healing. Every gala, every scholarship, every ribbon-cutting ceremony painted a picture of a family who not only held power, but used it for good. At the center of it all was Jackson Jose III. Educated at Ivy League schools, groomed to lead the empire, and polished for public appearances, Jackson was considered a modern gentleman of influence, sharp, compassionate, and respectable. After the sudden death of his parents, he was poised to inherit not just their fortune, but their moral legacy. To the public, he was the grieving son stepping into greatness. But behind the expensive suits, practiced speeches, and family name was a man protecting something dark. It began, as these things often do, with a secret relationship. Esther Daly was not born into power. She had grown up in hardship, raised her younger brother Sebastian after their parents died in a restaurant fire, and worked her way through community college while juggling two part-time jobs. When she was hired as a housekeeper in the Jose mansion 2 years prior, it seemed like a miracle. Steady income, respect, and an opportunity to be near Boston's most powerful family. At first, her presence went unnoticed. Quiet, efficient, and organized, she blended into the grand halls of Beacon Hill like furniture. But Jackson noticed her. He complimented her work ethic, brought her gifts, small at first, a watch, a scarf, a book she once mentioned. Eventually, conversations turned personal, private, then promises were made about love, about a future, about how different he was from the world she knew. Esther believed him. She believed him when he said his parents valued people, not appearances, that they would understand, that they would welcome her. She believed him when he said that love, not bloodlines, defined a family. And for a moment, she let herself imagine a new life, one where she wasn't cleaning silverware in silence, but standing proudly beside the man who claimed to love her. But love, real love, doesn't ask you to disappear. When Esther became pregnant, she was terrified but hopeful. She told Jackson the news gently, expecting fear, maybe shock. What she didn't expect was silence, then tension, then distance, then orders. Within days, she was quietly transferred to the Jose family's Newport summer house, under the guise of rest and privacy. But the staff there reported to Jackson directly. Surveillance cameras were installed, guards replaced gardeners. The once lavish coastal home became something else entirely. A gilded cage. Sebastian, her brother, only learned what was happening through secret letters and one desperate phone call. Esther told him she was scared, not just for her baby, but because of something else, something she had discovered while working late nights in the study of Jackson Jose Sierra, his father's office, the nerve center of the family's foundation. The books didn't add up. The records showed tens of millions donated to hospitals and educational programs. But when she compared those reports with the actual wire transfers, something was off. The money wasn't going where it was supposed to. Large sums were being funneled into private accounts, shell companies, offshore firms, even personal expenses disguised as logistics. It was embezzlement, sophisticated, hidden, but undeniable. And worse, the man she thought she loved knew about it. Jackson didn't react with panic when she confronted him. He didn't shout. He didn't deny it. He simply smiled and said, "There are things you don't understand, Esther. My parents are dreamers, but dreams don't sustain empires." That night, Esther began writing everything down. Diaries, letters, copies of every document she could find. She knew then she couldn't trust Jackson. Not with her child, not with her safety, and certainly not with the truth. What Sebastian revealed in the cathedral that day wasn't just the existence of a granddaughter. It was the beginning of a storm decades in the making, because this wasn't just a secret affair. It was a scandal poised to destroy one of Boston's most respected families. Catherine Jose, Jackson's aunt and a longtime board member of the family's foundation, had long suspected inconsistencies, but never had proof. Now, with Esther's letters, journal, and the child herself present in the cathedral, there was no turning back. Jackson stood frozen, his expression cracking as layers of lies peeled away. The man who had walked into the funeral as the polished heir now stood exposed before hundreds. Family, friends, press, and the ghosts of everything his family once stood for. And then came the most devastating moment. As Sebastian prepared to hand over Esther's diary to Catherine, he revealed one final truth. Esther had uncovered evidence suggesting that Jackson had not only embezzled millions, but had indirectly caused the deaths of his own parents. An anonymous tip had warned Lila and Jackson Sr. about the missing funds just days before their car accident. They had scheduled an emergency meeting with their auditors the very next morning, but they never made it because the car's brakes failed. Sebastian pulled out one final envelope, a signed statement from the Jose family's longtime mechanic, who had been paid handsomely to cover up the brake failure. Jackson had bribed him, hoping to delay the meeting, not kill them. But intentions don't erase consequences. And now, every truth Esther had feared would be buried had come flooding into the light. As the crowd gasped and murmurs erupted, as reporters captured every word, and Catherine's face drained of color, the Jose family's pristine legacy fractured completely. Their foundation, once a beacon of generosity, had been weaponized for fraud. Their son, meant to carry the torch, had nearly extinguished it. But in the arms of Sebastian stood something pure. A child, a granddaughter, a second chance. What had once been a scandal now held the potential to become a reckoning and a rebirth. Her name was Esther Daly, and for 2 years she was invisible, until her absence became impossible to ignore. Long before the scandal, before the headlines and the sirens, before the baby was carried into the cathedral like a secret too heavy to bury, Esther was just a girl trying to survive. She didn't grow up with power or prestige. She didn't wear designer labels or attend charity galas. Her life had been stitched together with grit, grief, and quiet determination. When their parents died in a restaurant fire, Esther stepped into a role far too big for her age. She was only 18 when she became both mother and father to her younger brother Sebastian. No one gave her a script. No one handed her a safety net. She survived on instinct. And her dream was simple: build a better life. She worked tirelessly, 2 jobs, school at night, never once asking for pity. So when she was offered a position as a housekeeper in the Jose family mansion, it felt like a small miracle. The pay was steady, the house was beautiful, and more than that, she felt safe for the first time in years. The mansion on Beacon Hill, with its ivy-covered walls and glittering chandeliers, represented something she'd never had: stability. At first, Esther kept to herself. She was efficient, respectful, and meticulous. She never missed a shift. She remembered everyone's preferences: how Lila liked her tea, what time Jackson Sr. read the paper, how the silverware was to be aligned before guests arrived. Catherine Jose once said she ran the household with the precision of a symphony conductor. But one person saw more than that: Jackson Jose III. It started subtly, a compliment here, a glance too long there, then gifts, small, expensive, personal. A silk scarf, a book she once mentioned in passing, a necklace she never dared wear. At first, Esther resisted. She'd seen enough of the world to know what happened to women in positions like hers. But Jackson was persuasive. He told her she was different, that she wasn't invisible to him, that he wasn't like the others. He listened when she spoke. He praised her mind. He said he admired her strength. And Esther, who had learned to doubt every promise, let herself believe just this once. They kept it quiet, a secret affair born in shadows, between whispers in the hallways and late-night conversations behind locked doors. But it wasn't just lust. Jackson spoke of love. He told her his parents would understand, that the foundation was built on compassion, not class, that their future didn't have to be a scandal. It could be a statement. Esther began to believe him. She imagined a life where she could finally exhale, where her daughter could be born into a legacy of inclusion rather than shame. But love, she would learn, can be the most sophisticated disguise for control. When she told Jackson she was pregnant, everything changed. His words became careful. His warmth turned calculating. And within days, she was gone. No grand goodbye, no public departure. She simply vanished. To the outside world, it was unremarkable. Housekeepers come and go. No headlines, no missing person reports. But to Sebastian, her brother, it was a scream in the void. Esther would never just leave him. Not without a word. Not without a reason. And that silence, it was louder than anything he'd ever heard. What no one knew was that Esther had been sent to the Jose family's summer estate in Newport, Rhode Island, a sprawling property with high walls and locked gates. Under the pretense of rest, Jackson had isolated her. Surveillance systems were installed. Guards posed as maintenance workers. And the house, once filled with laughter and coastal breeze, became a prison wrapped in privilege. She was watched, controlled, cut off from the world. But Esther wasn't just surviving, she was planning. She documented everything, every conversation, every threat, every financial record she could access. She knew she had become dangerous to Jackson, not just because of the baby, but because of what she had discovered. In the quiet hours of early pregnancy, she had found the truth about the foundation's finances. Millions of dollars meant for hospitals and children had vanished. And Jackson, the man who once whispered, "I love you," was at the center of it. Esther was trapped, but her mind remained free. She began writing letters, long, detailed messages of what had happened, what she had seen, what she feared. She gave them to a trusted few, a retired housekeeper named Mrs. Sullivan, a mechanic who serviced the Jose family cars, and most importantly, her brother Sebastian. In her final message, delivered only days before the funeral, she made one request. "If I disappear, bring Elaine to the church. Let the truth speak." And Sebastian did. On that rainy day, as hundreds mourned the deaths of Lila and Jackson Jose Sr., Sebastian walked through the cathedral doors carrying not just a baby, but a reckoning. He was only 17, but he carried the weight of decades of deception in his hands. When he announced that Elaine was the Jose's granddaughter, silence fell like a curtain. And when he revealed Esther's name, her absence became deafening. Suddenly, every eye turned toward Jackson III. Every whisper became a weapon. Esther had vanished because she knew too much, because she had trusted too deeply, because she had believed in the wrong man. But her disappearance was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of a battle she would fight from the shadows, through paper trails and hidden recordings, through coded notes and old allies who still believed in decency. And when she finally reappeared, frail, wet from the rain, and trembling at the cathedral doors, no one could deny what she had endured. She wasn't just a housekeeper anymore. She was a whistleblower, a mother, a woman who chose truth over silence. And her child, Elaine, was no longer a secret. She was a symbol of everything that had been buried and everything that could now rise. Cathedrals are built for quiet reverence. But on that day, it became a courtroom. And the boy, wet from the storm, was not the one on trial. He was the one holding the truth. As Sebastian Daly stood trembling in the center aisle of St. Michael's Cathedral, soaked to the bone, holding a baby that didn't belong in this setting of wealth and solemnity, a strange stillness settled over the grand interior. Outside, the rain pounded against the stained glass windows. Inside, every heart pounded louder. His voice, fragile but resolute, had pierced the sanctuary like lightning. "This is Elaine," I said back. He said again, he said it again, cradling the baby closer. "She's the granddaughter of Lila and Jackson Jose, and her mother is my sister, Esther Daly." The effect was immediate. Gasps, stifled cries, a reverent hush broken not by a hymn but by the sound of the past crashing into the present. The eyes of Boston's elite snapped toward the front pew, where Jackson Jose III stood frozen, his face pale, lips parted, but no words forming. The man known for his composure, charisma, and charm now looked like a ghost among mourners. His hands, so used to shaking with power, gripped the edge of the pew as if trying not to fall. But it was Catherine Jose, Lila's sister and the quiet guardian of the family's moral compass, who first stepped forward. Her voice trembled not with uncertainty but with fury restrained. "Jackson," she said, turning her gaze from the child to her nephew, "is this true? Still silence. Sebastian didn't wait. He reached into the folds of Elaine's pink blanket and retrieved an envelope, aged and worn. "This," he announced, lifting it high, "is Esther's diary, and the letter she left behind, proof of everything, of their relationship, of the pregnancy, of the threats, and of what she discovered about the foundation." Reporters who had come to cover a high-profile funeral were now live documenting a scandal. Phones were raised, notes scribbled. The cathedral had become a theater of reckoning. "She was your housekeeper," Sebastian continued, his voice growing stronger with every word. "But more than that, she was a human being. She trusted Jackson. She believed him when he said his family stood for something. She thought love was enough, but it wasn't, because when she told him she was pregnant, she disappeared." The baby stirred. A soft cry escaped her lips, as if sensing the weight of what was unfolding. The sound echoed off the vaulted ceilings, slicing through generations of decorum and denial. Catherine stepped closer to Sebastian, her eyes locked on the child. "Let me see her," she said softly. He nodded and carefully pulled back the blanket, revealing Elaine's full face. Catherine gasped. Those eyes, the unmistakable Jose gray blue, the shape of her chin, the curve of her brows. It wasn't a resemblance, it was a lineage. A bloodline staring back at her from the face of innocence. "She's one of us," she whispered, tears brimming. Dear God, they never knew. They died thinking they had no grandchildren. Then came the second bombshell. "Esther didn't just disappear," Sebastian said, straightening his back. "She was sent away, hidden, controlled. Because she found something in the foundation's records. Millions of dollars in misappropriated donations. Charities that didn't exist, hospitals that never received the help they were promised." Jackson's face broke. Sweat beaded along his temple, despite the chill in the cathedral. He opened his mouth, finally, his voice low, brittle, like a man watching his empire collapse. "You don't know what you're talking about." But Catherine turned sharply toward him. "Don't lie to us, Jackson. Not in this place, not in front of them." Sebastian continued, each sentence like a nail sealing the coffin of deceit. "Esther was told to keep quiet. She was locked in the Newport house, monitored. And when she tried to leave, Jackson threatened to take her baby away. But Esther, she didn't stop fighting. She documented everything. She left copies with people she trusted, people who are ready to testify." The baby whimpered again, and Sebastian gently rocked her, never breaking eye contact with the man he once saw as untouchable. "She knew if anything happened to her," he added, "someone had to bring Elaine to this cathedral, to this funeral. Because truth buried with the dead is no truth at all." By now, murmurs rippled through the crowd. Board members of the Jose Foundation exchanged uneasy glances. Former allies began pulling away. The carefully curated image of the Jose legacy was unraveling, thread by golden thread. And then, like a scene written for the stage, the cathedral doors opened once more. Everyone turned. There, framed by rain and shadow, stood Esther, alive, thin, pale, trembling, but unbroken. Her dark hair clung to her face, her eyes wide with exhaustion and purpose. She clutched a leather briefcase in her hands, her arsenal of truth. The cathedral erupted, people gasped, cameras clicked. Even the baby turned her head, recognizing the voice that whispered her name. "I won't be silenced anymore," Esther said, stepping forward. "And neither will the truth." Jackson took a step back, his face a portrait of horror. Esther's gaze didn't flicker. "You kept me hidden. You thought fear could keep me quiet, but I remembered something your parents once said in a foundation meeting. Real power doesn't come from control. It comes from courage." She walked the length of the aisle, every step reclaiming the space where she had once been invisible. When she reached Sebastian, she looked down at her daughter and broke into tears. The baby reached toward her, and the moment the two were reunited, mother and child, the entire cathedral seemed to hold its breath. Esther turned to face the crowd. "There's more," she said, raising the briefcase. "Documents, financial records, evidence of fraud, signed, sealed, and backed by witnesses. What happened in that foundation was not an accident, and what happened to Jackson and Lila Jose wasn't either." The confrontation had transformed into confession, not from Jackson, but from the truth itself. For years, they had hidden behind marble walls, gilded donations, and staged charity events. But now, in this sacred place, stripped of titles and illusions, the family faced itself. The cathedral, built for saints, became the sanctuary of a different kind of salvation: truth. And when Esther handed her baby to Catherine, she wasn't just passing a child into safe hands. She was passing the weight of legacy, a chance to rebuild, a declaration that what had been corrupted could still be redeemed, not through silence, but through courage. She had vanished like a ghost. Now she stood in the doorway like a storm that had found its voice. Esther Daly had been gone for 9 months. Not a word, not a sighting, just whispers, rumors, in the haunting absence of a woman too full of life to disappear without reason. For those who loved her, the silence was agonizing. For those who feared her truth, it was convenient. But Esther had never planned to vanish. She had been forced into the shadows, pushed into a silence that was never her choice. Her return wasn't just unexpected, it was seismic. The moment she stepped through the cathedral doors, soaked from the rain, thin and trembling yet unmistakably alive, everything stopped. Conversation ceased, breath caught, even the wind seemed to pause as her figure emerged from the blur of storm and stained glass. She wasn't just a mother returning, she was the truth made flesh. Clutched in her shaking hands was a leather briefcase, rain-darkened but tightly sealed. Inside it, months of evidence, handwritten letters, financial records, copies of files from the Jose Foundation, and details she had risked her life to gather. She was no longer the housekeeper, no longer the girl who once cleaned the baseboards of power. She had become its reckoning. As she walked down the center aisle, her boots echoing against the marble, all eyes followed her. But Esther wasn't looking at them. She wasn't even looking at Jackson, the man who had tried to erase her. Her gaze was fixed on one thing only: the child in her brother's arms. Elaine, her daughter, her reason for surviving. When the child heard her mother's voice, fragile, unsure, but undeniably familiar, she stirred. Small arms stretched outward. The crowd watched in collective awe as Sebastian gently handed the baby to Esther. And in that moment, with the child curled against her mother's chest like she had never left, the cathedral transformed. Grief gave way to awe. Suspicion gave way to truth. A child who had been denied her story was now cradled in the arms of the woman who had lived it. Tears fell freely down Esther's cheeks as she kissed her daughter's head. "I'm here," she whispered, rocking her gently. "Mama's here." It was a whisper louder than any accusation, but the moment was short-lived. Esther wiped her tears and turned back to the crowd. Her voice was hoarse from exhaustion, but her words were clear. "You've heard about the affair, the baby, the silence, but there's more. There's always more." She gestured to the briefcase. "In here is everything, every lie, every dollar that vanished, every threat Jackson made to keep me quiet. I was hidden, not because I was weak, but because I was dangerous to him, because I knew the truth." Gasps rippled across the pews. Jackson's jaw clenched. His polished composure continued to crumble with every word Esther spoke. "I never asked to be part of this family's legacy," she said. "I didn't fall in love with Jackson because of his name. I loved him because I thought I saw something real beneath the layers. But what I didn't see, what I refused to believe, was that I had become a liability." She stepped forward, the crowd parting for her like water. She passed Catherine Jose, who reached out and touched Elaine's tiny foot with trembling fingers. Then she stood face to face with Jackson Jose III. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Esther broke the silence. "You said you'd protect me, that you'd stand by us. And when I told you I was pregnant, you told me I was a mistake you couldn't afford." Jackson's eyes darted away. "You locked me away like a secret, hired people to watch me, stripped me of my freedom because I knew about the foundation." She turned to address the entire church now. It wasn't just about hiding a child. It was about hiding theft, embezzlement, abuse of trust. The Jose Foundation wasn't bleeding. It was being drained. And I found the leak. Esther opened the briefcase and pulled out folders. These are copies of financial transactions. Millions redirected to shell companies. Donations never delivered. Programs that only existed on paper. Jackson manipulated reports, lied to board members, lied to his parents. The crowd grew restless. Several people stood. Some looked shocked. Others looked ashamed. A few, mostly board members, looked scared. And then, she continued, her voice quieting, he tried to make sure his parents never found out. That line felt like a thunderclap. Catherine stepped forward. What are you saying? Esther turned. 3 days before their accident, Jackson's parents received an anonymous tip. They were preparing to meet with lawyers. They were going to expose the truth. Sebastian, now standing beside her, held up another envelope. But they never made it, Esther added, because their car's brakes failed. More gasps, shouts, phones raised. A detective in the crowd stood up slowly, listening intently now. I was there in Newport when Jackson got the call, Esther said, her eyes glistening. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just said, that solves everything. Jackson shouted suddenly, I never meant for them to die. His voice cracked. They were supposed to miss one meeting. That's all. I just needed more time. Esther stared at him. You gambled with their lives and you lost. The weight of that truth filled the cathedral like fog. But in the center of it all stood Esther, still holding her daughter, her greatest act of defiance against a system built to erase women like her. This child, she said, raising Elaine slightly, was never a threat to your legacy. She's the future of it, not because of your name, but because of the truth she was born into. Catherine came forward, her voice steady but soft. Esther, I believe you, and I promise this child will never be hidden again. Tears streamed down Esther's face. Thank you, but she's not just mine. She's all of ours now, because everything we do next will decide what kind of world she grows up in. In that moment, as the rain outside began to ease, as sun filtered through stained glass onto mother and child, the crowd knew they had witnessed something more than a confrontation. They had seen a woman rise from the shadows, not as a victim, but as the voice of everything they tried to bury. They were loved, admired, and revered. But the truth is, Jackson and Lila Jose didn't just die in a tragic accident. Their son had already begun writing their obituary long before the brakes failed. For weeks, Boston had mourned the loss of two of its most beloved figures, Lila and Jackson Jose Sr., champions of philanthropy, defenders of the underprivileged, architects of a foundation that had touched thousands of lives, were gone. The official cause, brake failure. A tragic mechanical malfunction that ended two extraordinary lives on a rainy Massachusetts road. But the truth, like all things buried beneath the surface of power, was far more chilling. When Esther Daly returned from her forced disappearance and revealed the extent of Jackson Jose III's manipulation, the mourners at St. Michael's Cathedral thought they had already heard the worst. The affair, the hidden child, the embezzlement. But Esther's voice, tired yet unwavering, carried one more revelation, one that turned mourning into outrage and grief into reckoning. They didn't just die, she said softly, holding her daughter. They were silenced. Silence fell over the cathedral like a wave. Esther reached into her leather briefcase and pulled out a printed email, dated just 3 days before the crash. Lila and Jackson Sr. had received an anonymous tip. Someone close to the foundation, someone who saw what was happening, told them the truth. That money was missing, that reports had been doctored, that their son, their only son, was behind it. Catherine Jose took the paper with trembling hands, reading it aloud. We will meet with the auditors Monday. If this is true, we must act swiftly. No legacy is worth protecting if it is built on deceit. The email ended with a line underlined by Lila's own hand. We have to protect the truth, even if it means protecting it from our son. Gasps swept across the pews. Several board members, now visibly shaken, exchanged fearful glances. But Esther wasn't done. The next day, she continued, Jackson had a conversation with the family's mechanic. His name is Mr. Rodriguez. He serviced the family's cars for 20 years. That night, Jackson offered him a large cash payment, one that was traced directly to a personal account. A man stood from the back pew, elderly, hands trembling, tears in his eyes. I'm Mr. Rodriguez, he said, and I lied. He pulled out a small notebook, worn and yellowed. When I checked the car after the accident, the brakes were damaged beyond question. But I was paid to say it was wear and tear. Jackson said he needed time. He said it wasn't what I thought. I was scared. But not as scared as I am now. The room spun. The myth of an accidental death unraveled in real time. Jackson stood frozen, staring at his former mechanic like he was watching a ghost return from the grave. I didn't mean for them to die, he whispered almost to himself. I just needed to delay the meeting. They weren't supposed to take the car. They were supposed to stay home, to listen. To let me explain. Esther turned, her voice cutting through the chaos like glass. You tampered with the car, Jackson. You paid someone to lie. You made a choice to put your reputation above their lives. You played Van with a clock you couldn't control, and time ran out. Catherine Jose, once the picture of poise, looked shattered. You murdered your parents. No, Jackson shouted, his face twisted with anguish. It wasn't supposed to be like that. I thought they would understand. I just needed them to stop pressing, to give me more time. I didn't know the brakes would what? Catherine snapped. Would fail? Would kill them? That's what brakes do when they're broken, Jackson. The entire cathedral felt like it was trembling, but the true quake was inside every heart, reconciling the man they had admired with the monster that now stood before them. Sebastian stepped forward, handing another document to the detective present. There's more, he said. Mr. Rodriguez kept records, copies of emails, deposit slips, and Jackson's written instructions. He told him exactly what to say to the media after the crash. The detective reviewed the evidence. Slowly, he nodded. This isn't just fraud, he said. This is criminal negligence, conspiracy, possibly involuntary manslaughter. Jackson Jose III looked like a man whose lungs had collapsed. His perfectly tailored suit clung to his trembling frame. All the money, the influence, the image, it couldn't save him from the gravity of his own decisions. Not anymore. Esther's voice softened, but the impact remained. They were your parents, Jackson, and they died by thinking they had failed you. But the truth is, you failed them. The quiet that followed was unbearable. Then Catherine whispered, they knew. Everyone turned. She held up a final letter, its paper fragile, its ink slightly smudged by water and tears. It was addressed to Esther, but meant for Elaine. They found out about the baby 2 days before they died, Catherine said. They weren't angry. They were overjoyed. Lila had already started planning the nursery. Jackson Sr. said Elaine would be the beginning of a better legacy. Esther collapsed into tears. They were going to protect her, Catherine continued. They were going to rewrite the will. And you, Jackson, you couldn't stand it. That the empire wasn't going to be yours alone. The dam broke. Jackson sank to his knees between the caskets of his parents, his face contorted by grief and guilt. He reached out as if to touch the carved wood, but stopped, his hand frozen midair, as if even in death, his parents would recoil from him now. I didn't mean for this, he cried. But you did it anyway, Esther replied, her voice flat. And now the truth has a body count. The detective stepped forward, reading him his rights. The same voice he once used to charm donors and business moguls now shook as they handcuffed him in front of the people who once cheered his name. But even that wasn't the true ending. As Jackson was led away, Elaine let out a small cry, not from fear, but as if she had absorbed the energy in the room. Catherine gently lifted her from Esther's arms and whispered, You'll never know them, little one, but you'll know the truth. And that's more than your father ever gave them. The sunlight, piercing through the stained glass, fell upon the faces of those who remained, not just witnesses, but survivors. And in that light, a truth once buried in shadows finally stood visible in full. It was never an accident. It was a warning, one the city would never forget. When the truth finally broke through the cathedral walls, it didn't just bring justice, it laid the foundation for redemption. Not just for a family, but for a legacy that had nearly been lost. The police car had barely turned the corner when the silence inside St. Michael's Cathedral finally settled. Jackson Jose III was gone, escorted out in handcuffs, his head bowed not from prayer, but from shame. The son who was once praised as the future of Boston's most celebrated philanthropic dynasty had now become the very thing that dynasty was built to fight against: greed, deception, and power abused in secret. But what remained wasn't just the wreckage of a scandal. It was the question of what would rise from it. Esther stood quietly, her daughter Elaine nestled against her chest. The child had fallen asleep amidst the storm, her breathing soft and steady, like a symbol of everything that still had a chance to heal. Around them, mourners remained seated, stunned, processing. Some wept openly. Others stared at the caskets of Lila and Jackson Sr., as if searching for their guidance even now. Then Catherine Jose stepped forward. She had not cried since the moment she held the letter revealing that her late sister and brother-in-law knew about Elaine and had welcomed her with open hearts. But now, with Jackson gone and Esther standing strong, something broke loose within her, a determination deeper than sorrow. "We can't let it end here," she said, her voice echoing through the cavernous church. Lila and Jackson built their lives on compassion, service, and truth. Their son tried to destroy it, but their granddaughter, she will carry it forward. It was more than a promise, it was a mission. Over the next few days, Boston would come to learn the full scope of the deception. Newspapers splashed headlines about the Jose Foundation's internal corruption, hidden shell charities, stolen funds. Audits from over 5 years were unsealed, revealing that Jackson had quietly diverted millions she meant for hospitals, schools, and mental health programs into offshore investments. But alongside the revelations came something no one expected: action. Esther, though exhausted, stepped into the chaos not with vengeance, but with clarity. She met with the remaining board members of the Jose Foundation. She brought the documents, the letters, the emails. She didn't demand money. She demanded transparency. And Catherine stood by her side at every step. They made calls. They reopened the books. They hired independent investigators. And most importantly, they began repaying every dollar that had been stolen. Under their joint leadership, the Jose Foundation didn't collapse. It transformed. The structure was overhauled. A new board was formed, not just of corporate elites and legacy figures, but of community leaders, teachers, former beneficiaries, and hospital administrators. People who understood what the foundation had meant at its best. People who wouldn't look away. Each time a restitution check was delivered to a hospital or school that had been promised funding but never received it, Esther delivered it herself. She met with nurses, with social workers, with children whose programs had been cut and whose futures had been left in limbo by Jackson's betrayal. She didn't go as a martyr, she went as a mother. Elaine always came with her, sometimes in her arms, sometimes toddling at her side. A quiet reminder that the future wasn't something to inherit, it was something to earn. Sebastian, once the frightened teenage boy who burst into a funeral soaked in rain, was now being offered scholarships to study nonprofit ethics and public service. The boy who had once been dismissed as an outsider was now considered a voice of conscience. And Jackson? He remained in custody. His plea deal included full cooperation with ongoing investigations, public apologies, and the forfeiture of his personal inheritance, reallocated to rebuild the very programs he had once defunded. In prison, he began writing letters, not for forgiveness, but for understanding. Monthly reflections addressed to Elaine, saved by Esther in a blue box once belonging to Lila. Letters that would one day show her not just the darkness her father fell into, but his struggle to climb back out. Redemption, after all, isn't about erasing the past. It's about confronting it and doing something better with the pain. At the 1-year anniversary of the funeral that changed everything, St. Michael's Cathedral was full again. But this time the air was different. Light poured through the stained glass windows without tension. There was no grief, only remembrance. And in the front pew sat Esther, Sebastian, Catherine, and Elaine, now walking, full of curiosity and laughter. The cathedral that once held the sound of secrets breaking now echoed with the sounds of life beginning. Father Matthews, the same priest who had opened the service for Lila and Jackson Sr., stepped forward once more. But instead of a eulogy, he performed a christening. Elaine Jose Daly was baptized beneath the same vaulted ceiling where her existence had once shattered a family's facade. Now she was being blessed not as a scandal, but as a symbol of healing. Later that day, in the Jose family mansion, no longer silent, no longer haunted, Catherine led Esther to Lila's old study. On the desk sat the revised documents for the foundation. Its new name had been finalized. The Lila and Jackson Jose Center for Integrity and Community Service. It was more than a name. It was a declaration. That's what they always wanted, Catherine said, her voice tender. Not prestige, not power, just impact, just truth. Esther nodded, tears in her eyes. Then that's what we'll give them. And so the Jose legacy lived on, not in gala dinners or press releases, but in food banks fully funded, in school programs reopened, in cancer wards restored, in letters written from a prison cell, in a blue box full of pain and progress, in the laughter of a child who would grow up knowing the full truth and still be proud of her name. Justice had arrived not with vengeance, but with transformation. Redemption wasn't an erasure of what had been, but a recommitment to what must come next. Because the real legacy was never in the fortune. It was in the courage to face the truth, and in the choice to build again, this time with eyes wide open. She never spoke a word, yet she said everything. Elaine Jose Daly, wrapped in pink that rainy morning, didn't just interrupt a funeral. She redefined a legacy. When the truth shattered the silence inside St. Michael's Cathedral, the scandal wasn't what people remembered most. It was the child. The baby girl held in Sebastian's arms as he stood trembling in the aisle, defying power, fear, and a room full of disbelief. She didn't cry loudly, she didn't scream, but with every innocent breath she took beneath those vaulted ceilings, she declared one thing to everyone present. This is not the end. Elaine was born into chaos, conceived in secrecy, carried in fear, nearly erased by the very man who gave her life. Yet somehow, despite the lies, the threats, and the silence that had surrounded her, she survived. Not just physically, but symbolically. In a family unraveling under the weight of its own corruption, she became the one truth no one could deny. And as it turned out, she was also the one truth powerful enough to rebuild what had been broken. In the weeks after the funeral, headlines screamed betrayal, fraud, and scandal. But quietly beneath the noise, something extraordinary began to unfold. Because of her. Elaine became a symbol not of shame, but of resilience. Her presence softened hardened hearts and rewrote family roles. Catherine Jose, once cold and distant, now cradled Elaine like the daughter she never had. She insisted the child's name include Jose, not for pride, but to ensure her identity could never again be denied. She has every right to it, Catherine had said, wiping tears from her cheek. And more than that, she will redeem it. And Esther, who had once feared her daughter would grow up fatherless, legacyless, or worse, hidden, began to realize that Elaine didn't need to inherit a flawless name. What she would inherit instead was something far greater. Truth. While the foundation unraveled and restructured, while board members resigned and new ones were elected, Elaine became a familiar sight in rooms once ruled by polished liars. As Esther met with lawyers, accountants, and charity directors, Elaine played at her feet. She giggled during budget meetings. She clutched the fingers of social workers. She reached for the cheeks of reporters who had once come for the scandal, but stayed for the story of healing. She reminded everyone that this wasn't just about restoring trust in an institution. It was about restoring trust in something far more personal. Family, community, humanity. 1 year later, during the christening ceremony held at the very cathedral where her life had first been revealed, Elaine sat wide-eyed in her mother's arms as Father Matthew sprinkled holy water on her forehead. The entire city watched, not just the political elite, but everyday people, nurses, teachers, former beneficiaries of the foundation, the ones who had been forgotten when the money vanished and programs were cut. They came back, not out of loyalty to the Jose name, but out of faith in the little girl who now represented its rebirth. Sebastian stood beside Esther during the ceremony, more confident than he'd ever been. He had watched over his sister his entire life, and now he watched over his niece, not as a protector from danger, but as a guardian of her story. His scholarship application essay that year would begin with this sentence: "I carried my niece into a funeral and walked her out into history." The Jose family mansion, once a place of secrets and silence, was now alive with light. Elaine's laughter echoed through its halls as she learned to walk between photos of her grandparents, Lila and Jackson Sr., whose legacy she would someday learn about not through myth, but through diaries, letters, and the raw, beautiful truth. In her nursery, Esther placed a framed line from Lila's last letter. "You are not born from scandal, child. You are born from strength. Elaine's crib sat beside a wall of changing photographs, the reopening of hospital wings, the restoration of after-school programs, the smiling faces of children who had once been on waiting lists that disappeared with the money. Now those smiles were framed beside her own, a collage of what real redemption looks like. And as the foundation grew stronger, more transparent, and more inclusive, Elaine's impact was felt even beyond her physical presence. A scholarship was launched in her name, the Elaine Fund, supporting children of single mothers pursuing education and community leadership. Esther, holding Elaine as she gave her first public speech, said, "This isn't about making up for the past. It's about making space for a future that never would have existed without her." Even Jackson, from his prison cell, seemed to understand what Elaine represented. His letters, written monthly and stored in Lila's blue box, never asked for sympathy, but they always began the same way. "Dear Elaine, I see more clearly now. Whether she ever reads them is a choice that will one day be hers. But the fact that they exist, written with trembling remorse and raw reflection, speaks to her quiet power." Because Elaine was never loud. She didn't need to be. She was living proof that even in the ashes of betrayal, something sacred can still be born. That even when the truth arrives covered in rain and wrapped in blankets, it carries the power to stop a city in its tracks. She was a baby, but she was also a mirror. And when the world looked at her, into those gray-blue Jose eyes, they didn't just see lineage, they saw possibility. A second chance, not to forget the past, but to face it and choose better. As spring returned to Boston and the mansion's gardens bloomed again, Elaine took her first steps across the lawn, barefoot, laughing, chasing sunbeams. Mrs. Sullivan, the retired housekeeper who had once helped Esther escape, wiped a tear from her cheek as she watched. "This child," she whispered to Catherine. "She is everything they were supposed to be." Catherine nodded. "No, she's everything they still can be." In a world that once tried to erase her, Elaine Jose Daly became the child who couldn't be forgotten. She was born from courage. She grew into truth, and in the hearts of those who dared to love her, protect her, and rebuild because of her, she would forever remain the symbol of a legacy that refused to die. Truth doesn't destroy legacies. It reveals the kind worth keeping. At its core, the story of the Jose family is not just about scandal, betrayal, or justice. It's about the extraordinary power of truth to both hurt and heal. It's about what happens when carefully constructed images collapse, and the people left behind must decide whether to run from the rubble or rebuild something better from it. In real life, we are often told to protect appearances, to stay silent for the sake of reputation, to avoid conflict even when something feels wrong. But the story of Esther Daly, her daughter Elaine, and the broken but redeemable Jose legacy teaches us the opposite. Truth, even when painful, is the foundation of real freedom. Esther didn't just expose corruption, she chose integrity over fear. She proved that being unheard doesn't mean being powerless, and that motherhood, far from being a weakness, can be the strongest force for justice. Her courage reminds us that we all have a responsibility to speak up when something is wrong, even if the cost is high, because silence might protect comfort, but it never protects character. Catherine's journey reminds us of another truth. It's never too late to do the right thing. Redemption is not about pretending the past didn't happen. It's about refusing to let it define the future. And Elaine, though just a child, represents something rare and powerful in every generation, the chance to start again, with eyes wide open. This story urges us to look deeper into the institutions, families, and stories we admire. Are they built on truth or on image? And more importantly, when we see cracks, will we cover them or will we shine light into them? In a culture obsessed with perfection, may we choose honesty. In a world that rewards control, may we choose compassion. And in a society that often forgets its mistakes, may we raise our children not to repeat history, but to heal it. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply tell the truth.